Hello, everyone. Welcome to the newest edition of Lunch with the League. This is a production of the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County in partnership with the League of Women Voters of California's Housing and Homelessness Interest Group. That's a long-winded thing to say. My name is Glenn Silloway. I'm the Social Policy Director of the League of SLO County. Our moderator today will be Terry Neustadter, who's the co-chair of the League of California Interest Group, and our guest, who is bringing us the good info on housing, is Helmi Hisarick, Director of the Portland, Oregon Housing Bureau. I do want to call your attention to one more webinar that's coming up related to social housing. Put this on your, write it down. Hopefully it'll be on our end note, but if not, the Global Policy Leadership Academy has been running trips to Vienna for several years now. And they want to talk about that in a webinar that's coming up on April 18th. It's going to be at 11 o'clock. I assume that's Pacific time. And we will try to get a link on the end note for you, or you can look up the Global Policy Leadership Academy and find the link on their website, I'm sure. Now, before I hand off to Terry in this tag team, there's a couple housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded. You will be able to find it on the League of Women Voters SLO County website under News and Events / Archives, or at our YouTube channel on the Google YouTube channel. Just search for it and you'll find it. We are going to have a PowerPoint available. Helmi's agreed to share that. Hopefully we'll get that link up on the social policy page of the League of Women Voters SLO County website soon. So if you want to revisit, you can do that at that point. Now we're going to look forward to taking your questions. If you have one, you can post it anytime in the Q&A. We are not going to have a public chat available. We will address as many questions as possible, and with some editing if necessary to combine similar ones. Terry will be moderating this discussion, and it'll be her and Helmi interacting on that basis. Finally, we're scheduled for about 1 hour to end at 1 p.m. However, sometimes we have some good questions hanging at the end, and if Helmi has time and you want to hang in there, we'll stay around for another 10 minutes or so and try to get to the most important questions. Now, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Terry Neustadter, who will introduce Helmi and moderate the discussion later. Take it away, Terry.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks for helping to get this all set up for us.
Yeah.
It is my pleasure to introduce Helmi, who is in 2024 became the director of the Portland Housing Bureau. And you may be wondering, why Portland in California? And that's because Helmi has spent most of her life in California. And she spent 22 years with the city of LA. As the deputy mayor at one point for housing and homelessness, as well as the director of housing development and finance for the LA Housing Department, which helped to develop 6,000 units of affordable housing. Her life has been dedicated to advancing solutions to the affordable housing and homelessness crisis. And in 2021, I think, Helmi switched jobs and went on to become the director of the Global Policy Leadership Academy that Lynn was just referencing. And it's an educational institution that prepares policy leaders to take on complex societal issues. And housing and homelessness is part of that. But this allowed her to take U.S. policy leaders over to Austria so that they could examine the Vienna social housing model. And it's known as probably the most livable city in the world. So with that, I'm going to let Helmi take over and tell us, kind of just try to sum up all of her knowledge and give us some insights on how we can potentially get some different social housing, affordable housing models going in California.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Glenn. Really, really pleased to be here with everybody today. My name is Helmi Hisarick, and as Terry mentioned, I'm the director at the Portland Housing Bureau. And let me load my presentation, and then I'm going to actually tell you a little bit about my housing journey. So I have to just take a minute here to figure out how to share. Hello, where did my presentation go? Okay. Hopefully this will be, we can all see this. Is that good? Can you see it? Okay. So, so let me just begin by sharing a little bit of my own personal learning process on social housing. Uh, as Terry mentioned, I worked for 22 years for the city of Los Angeles. Most of the time I spent working in the housing and homelessness field and doing work from the public sector side. And in about 2016, it sort of dawned on me that I had become an expert in a system that was not working. No matter how hard we worked to solve housing and homelessness, and trust me, the people of the city and all the nonprofits involved and all of the many, many advocates for housing were working very, very hard to solve a complex problem. And the problem continued to worsen. And it seemed that something was wrong with the system. And so at that point, I started to explore ideas from places where it was working. I really basically had this idea that somebody has solved the housing crisis somewhere, and I wanted to understand who had and how they did it. And that is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've learned over the last few years, and so let me just dive right in and tell you where we are today. So I'm trying to advance the slide and it's not, oh, there we go. Okay, so just about 2 weeks ago, the city of Portland, Oregon, has launched a resolution requesting the Portland Housing Bureau to study social housing. And this is happening actually all over the country and including in California. In 2023, California launched a statewide study of social housing that I believe is being led by the Turner Center at UC Berkeley. I think Global Policy Leadership Academy is participating in sharing information specifically around Vienna. And many folks are coming together to kind of figure out the system. It's happening in other places around the country. In Seattle, they created a social housing agency, just recently adopted a dedicated funding stream, like 2 weeks ago, dedicated a funding stream to the social housing agency in Seattle. In Montgomery County, Maryland, they established in 2022 a revolving loan fund that enables their housing authority to have publicly owned mixed income housing. That is gaining a lot of traction around the country. Others are trying to emulate that model. And similarly, in Atlanta, Georgia, and Portland, Maine, city of Los Angeles, all over the country, people are starting to look at social housing as a potential alternative to the way we currently do affordable housing in the US. So as part of the study that Portland is going to do, we're going to look at the domestic models and we're going to start taking a look at some of the international models. So on the international side, I'm having a little difficulty figuring out how to advance my screen. Let me. Oh, never mind. Figured it out. There we go. Okay. So on the international front, there's many models. Mexico just announced about 2 weeks ago, President Sheinbaum of Mexico announced that they're planning to do $1 million of social housing nationwide, focus on sustainability. Social housing has been very common in many, many of the countries in Europe, particularly led by Denmark and Sweden. They have had a long-term social housing, as mentioned here in Copenhagen, over 20% of the housing stock is considered social housing. Singapore has a model that is an ownership-based model that is very similar to the social housing model that you see in Europe. Vancouver, British Columbia has an effort around social housing, or what they call non-market housing. And Vienna, Austria is one of the leaders in the world on social housing. And actually, that is what I want to spend a little time on today, is really sharing with you the Vienna model. When I started looking at models around the world, I was particularly struck by the Vienna, Austria model of social housing. One, because I'll tell you why. So this reason I got interested in them is actually rather simple, is about 100 years ago, Vienna was considered the worst place to live in Europe. They had something on the order of 30,000 houseless people living on sort of makeshift shelters on public land throughout the city of Vienna. The causes of that were related to a massive immigration that occurred in Vienna after World War I. But essentially, the conditions in Vienna that are described in Vienna in 1918 are not unlike what I've seen in many of the West Coast cities now. Certainly, I certainly paid attention to it in Los Angeles, where you see a lot of people living unsheltered and trying to get by. Um, Today, Vienna is ranked the most livable city in the world, and they have been ranked that by The Economist, by a few Mercer and a few other ranking entities, and they're repeatedly rank in the number one or in the top two or three spaces, the top slots worldwide. And so I was very interested in trying to understand the journey from being the worst place to live to being the best place to live in the world. And what does it take to get there? And affordability and how they create affordability in Vienna is a big part of the reason that they are ranked so high. So very big picture, this is kind of the Vienna social housing system, and I'm going to walk through key elements of it. First of all, in Vienna or in Austria, they take the point of view that housing is a human right. They did not adopt it into their legal framework. It's really just informs how they do their work. And it's really fascinating when you get to talking to the housing leaders in Vienna, because they all kind of come at it from the perspective that there's this urgent human right to housing that we as the public sector should be supporting. They do it through a variety of different approaches, but some of the key things in their system are that they have a very large municipal housing sector. They have a very large limited profit housing sector. They have a permanent source of funding for housing, and they have a very proactive land bank. So I'll talk about each of these things in this presentation. Interestingly, yes?
I have a question that came up.
Yeah.
Some of our attendees aren't as familiar with social housing. Can you do a definition of how Vienna looks at it? Like
But that's actually gonna, yes, thank you.
Okay.
It's a really good question. I get asked this question all the time. What is social housing? Rather than give you a definition, I'm going to walk through a couple of slides and hopefully we'll be able to tease out the definition because it's not as straightforward as you might think. So it'll be in the next two slides, we'll cover this topic, the why or what of housing. Just one quick thing I want to mention is that social housing in Austria is actually largely supported by the right and the left politically. It's not a big debate about whether social housing should exist. It's really there's policy differences and implementation that different. So first of all, and this is what I was trying to say, is that social housing isn't one thing. It actually takes many different forms. It can be implemented in a multiple different ways. And there are some key characteristics about what is in social housing. But in Vienna, there are a variety of ways of implementing. The two most common ways of implementing social housing are municipal housing, which is essentially publicly owned housing. The city of Vienna owns 220,000 units of public housing or municipally owned housing. They own, manage, lease, and maintain this housing in the public ownership. They're the largest owner of public housing in all of Europe. And that's because at the time in the 1980s, when a lot of other countries that had social housing were privatizing theirs, Vienna opted to keep their social housing in public ownership. However, There's also 220,000 units of limited profit housing, which is owned by nonprofits. So both of these are forms of social housing. There's a limited profit model entirely owned by the private sector in that are nonprofit organizations or limited profit organizations. And then there's a whole way, several different ways of implementing social housing. Smart apartments are micro units that are usually within the limited profit sector. Owner cooperatives are cooperatively owned apartment buildings where tenants come together to manage the ownership and to make decisions together. Vienna has something they call gentle density, which you can see the picture here is there's an existing apartment building, and on top of it they have by right the ability to build on top, and so those increases in density actually are allowed if they trade essentially what we would call affordability units within the building. So there's an increase in the density plus coupled by some affordability requirements. And then lastly, on the far right, this is a temporary housing that they've used in the social housing model in Vienna. And it is this particular housing development was built for refugees on land that was converted to residential use for 10 years only. So for 10 years, they're going to put refugees in temporary housing, modular housing. And then these housing units, these modular units are intended to be moved every 10 years. So they can last for 30 years and be continually moved. So the refugee housing is also part of the social housing framework. So this is where I'm going to try to explain a little bit about social housing models. And one of the most important ways to do it is to look at the differences between a US city and Vienna, Austria, and how the housing is comprised. So in the United States, using Portland as an example, the vast majority of housing is owned and operated by the private sector. 92% of the housing in Portland is market rate housing, and approximately 8% of it is regulated, affordable public sector housing. So that includes all of the public housing, all of the nonprofit low-income housing tax credit, all of the rental vouchers. So that's about 8% of the housing supply, and everything else is in the market. And Portland is actually better off than most West Coast cities, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, all up and down the coast. Usually there's less than 6% is affordable. So Portland is actually ahead of the game. The 6% number actually holds true for Seattle and Vancouver, British Columbia as well. So, Portland actually has 8%, which is high relative to others, but you can see the vast majority is in the market. Compare that to Vienna, Austria. So Vienna, first of all, is a very pro-housing place. They actually have one housing unit for every 2 people. When I compare that to Portland and most other West Coast cities, we have one housing unit for every 3 people. So they have just more housing. It's the first step. They have a very active private market housing, and it is exactly like our private market. You can rent, you can own. They have more multifamily than we do. So condos are more common than single family homes, but they have both. They have single family, they have condos, they have apartments, and it functions exactly the same way as in the United States. But a much larger share of their housing is outside of the market, and they have 2 models. So the first, which I mentioned before, is municipal housing. So municipal housing in Vienna is part of the social housing sector, and it is most similar to affordable housing, our tax credit housing, or public housing. It's pretty deeply subsidized, and it is primarily targeted to people who, in the case of the United States, it's targeted to people who are very low income. In the case of Vienna, it's targeted to people of great housing need. So it's less focused on income and more focused on need. Granted, they have considerably more than we have, so they can target on need and not so much exclusively on income. They also have a third sector of housing that we don't have, which is called limited profit housing. The limited profit housing has some similarities to limited equity home ownership on community land trusts, often done by like Habitat for Humanity. So it's the community land trust movement. It's very active in Oregon and pretty active in California as well as housing cooperatives and co-housing. And so the models that do exist in the US right now are mostly done in the context of a market. So you might have a co-housing development and the houses transact as market rate housing. The difference in Vienna is they transact outside of the market. So they're held with limited equity growth. And that's a huge sector in Vienna. And together, 44% of all housing in Vienna is out of the market. So that's one key characteristic of social housing, is that it exists outside of the market. All right, I'm going to keep going. So let me talk a little bit about the municipal housing sector. The picture you're looking at is George Washington Hof, which is in Vienna. In 1920s, there was a period of time in Vienna called Red Vienna when they were trying to respond to this massive homelessness crisis. And they essentially created a very aggressive tax on all luxury items and plowed those funds into the creation of housing. And they built in Vienna, 65,000 units of social housing, specifically municipally owned social housing, in a period of 10 years. So it was a very, very aggressive approach. And most of the housing from that time looks like what you see on the screen. And it was named after revolutionaries. So this particular housing is named after George Washington, who they held up as a great revolutionary. This period of time called Red Vienna is unique in history. It's well worth looking at and understanding. And it created the supply in Vienna of a lot of public housing. What I will say is that unlike in the US, where public housing is very stigmatized, in Vienna, it is not stigmatized. It's actually sought after and appreciated. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the municipal housing version of social housing. So it's generally speaking open to anyone who is an Austrian citizen or an EU citizen or a permanent resident of Austria or refugee. Anybody who's legally allowed to reside in Austria is eligible to come in. And Vienna is actually a front door for a lot of immigration coming in from Syria, Turkey, as well as from other parts of the EU. So it's a very heterogeneous city full of many different people speaking many different languages. So most social housing is open to everyone there who is, the vast majority of people who are living in Austria are eligible. In addition to which, your income limits in social housing are very high in Austria. It's generally speaking about 180% of the median income. So virtually everybody, 80% of the population, is eligible to live in social housing. The municipal housing, though, is primarily targeted at the lower income or more urgent need housing. So the city is the entity that leases up the municipal housing. It's a very publicly controlled process for getting the housing. So even though you might income qualify, you actually have to show a justified need and be selected by the city. So the justified needs are things like you live in an overcrowded apartment. They actually have a pipeline specifically for young people. So if you're young and you're trying to get out of your home and, start your own life separate from your family, you're actually there's a pipeline really focused on trying to help young people form households. There's also specific targets for elderly and age-related housing needs, special needs folks, single parents, or actually any parent who there's a lot of focus on housing stability for young families. So not only single parents, but there's a pipeline for folks if you're facing an urgent need. For example, you just got a divorce and now you need to have two separate households where the children can have stability, they will actually prioritize you for housing units. Because they have so much public housing, the wait times are quite short. Many people are eligible, and really the allocation of the housing has specifically, of the municipal housing, is specifically focused on oriented towards need. Okay, I'm now going to talk a little bit about limited profit housing, which is the sector we don't have. And this is also social housing. It's just structured differently. And currently in Vienna, this is the most common form of social housing being built. So this is the newer stuff. This really took off in the 1990s. Pictures you're seeing here are limited profit housing that was actually built in the last 10 years. All of it's really pretty new. And you can see most of the housing in Vienna is about 5 or 6 stories tall. This is very typical of what you'll see there. So, Wohnungsgemeinnützigkeitsgesetz is one of my favorite words because it's incredibly long and fun to say. But what it means is the Limited Profit Housing Act in Austria. So limited profit housing, very much like the municipal housing, is housing that's outside of the market. That's one of the key characteristics of social housing, is that it's not impacted by market prices. What's different about limited profit housing is that it is, when it opens up, a lot of it is not far off of the market. It is, the rents in limited profit housing are based on the cost of construction. So the limited profit housing associations started about 100 years ago when they first started building social housing. And they started to form housing cooperatives, which isn't something we are familiar with here in the United States. But the housing cooperatives sort of grew up at the same time as labor unions. And the idea was that people came together to start building housing associations. And these housing associations are typically formed as a co-op, where the members of the co-op get to vote on the organization's priorities. So within Austria, there's 182 limited profit housing associations, and 97 of them are co-ops. 75 are limited liability companies, and 10 are public limited companies, meaning they sort of started in the public sector and then transferred over into this more limited profit model. The limited profit housing associations, the closest thing we have would be a nonprofit affordable housing provider. So we have nonprofit affordable housing providers, and they often are serving a particular constituency. Like they might want to serve seniors, or they might serve people within a particular community. The same is true of the limited profit housing associations. They often are organized to serve a particular constituency. And these limited profit housing associations, what's different than our nonprofits is that in most cases, these limited profit housing associations offer a range of housing types to everybody. So they might offer, housing for young people, as well as housing for families with children. So, first they'll have small units, and then they'll have 2-bedroom units, and then they'll even have single family homes in their portfolio, and people stay within these cooperatives for their life and they move around. So that is one of the things about their model that's somewhat different from ours. And the Limited Profit Housing Act, just quickly, is that the rents are cost-based. And it's really different from the US system, where our rents are income-based. We tend to want to focus our housing on deeply affordable housing. They tend to focus their housing on just building housing and then taking it out of the market. So what happens is they build a house, and the rents on the day one that it's built might be close to market, but then they're held steady or constant over time. So what happens is, over time, as the loans are paid off and the debt goes down, the units remain affordable. And over time, you have a supply in the city of quite a lot of affordable housing. It actually becomes affordable over time. At the time that it's built, half of the units are allocated to the city to lease up through justified need. And if a lower income household is going into a limited profit unit, they may need a rent subsidy. So the city might provide a rent subsidy. This type of housing actually is a relatively low subsidy from the public sector standpoint. The housing is built and the rents are based on cost, so it's financeable at the time it's constructed. But working closely with the city, some of the units are set aside for deep affordability, and many are really close to market. It's just that when somebody gets into this unit, most people are eligible to get into this housing. When you get into the unit, what you know is that your housing price is going to remain pretty constant over time. It's kind of like ownership. In some cases, they do allow ownership in the limited profit model. It's like we would think of it as home ownership, only their orientation is to try to make it more easier to get into than say buying a home. We have our homes are all fluctuating and going, the prices are increasing based on market pressure. And in this case, they're really limiting the upside on the equity. So permanent source of funding, one of the critical things in their whole housing ecosystem in Vienna is having a permanent source of funds. The way they have funds available is they have a federal income tax of 1%, and then they allocate that funding. It's half paid by the employer and half paid by the employee. And that 1% income tax comes in every year and is allocated to the state. Vienna is a city and a state, so they get a direct allocation of funding for housing. In addition to which, they get loan repayments and lease rental income from their municipal and limited profit portfolio. And that combined between their loan repayments and their ground leases, as well as the income tax, they get a total of $450 million in the city of Vienna to allocate for housing. The vast majority of it is allocated to capital, including funding for land, which is 2/3 of the funding is for land and new construction. 1/3 is for rehabilitation of existing buildings. And then another smaller portion of funding is allocated to rent subsidies. And this is how they drive down the rents in that limited profit. So it seems like a lot of funding for housing compared to the US, but in fact, we spend almost the same amount of funds through our tax credit system, through our mortgage interest deduction process. So we spend a lot more money, and our money just hits the system differently. Their focus is on trying to ensure that a large portion of housing is out of the market and remains affordable over time. Another key piece of the Vienna system is their land bank. So they have a very, very active land bank. The picture you see here is the deputy mayor of an executive counselor for housing and women, excuse me, named Katharine Gall. She is also chairs this organization that is known as Wohnfonds Wien. Wohnfonds Wien is a quasi-governmental entity. It actually lives off of its own revenues. It does get money to purchase land, but it doesn't get any administrative funding. It generates administrative funding through ground leases and other types of activity. In many respects, you can think of it as a redevelopment agency. It's very similar to the old redevelopment that the California used to have, except it's exclusively focused on housing, and it's highly connected to their estimated need for new housing. So they're forecasting how much housing is needed, and they're buying land ahead of time. And this is the agency that buys land, clears land, entitles land, and makes it available for social housing. There's actually a zoning law in Vienna where all land that is purchased that's non-residential and then converted to residential use is required to be 2/3 social housing. So 2/3 of the new property that's coming in for housing is social housing. The purpose of this is essentially to recognize that as cities grow and land becomes scarcer, you can't keep making new land, a fair amount of land is really being held by the public sector for the purpose of delivering residential property at prices people can afford. So that's a sort of the public purpose of this land bank. They also act as a convener of multiple agencies. So the Woonfonds Wien will pull together the planning department, the transportation department, the water department, the parks department, and they help everybody sort of figure out how to create high quality of life by bringing all these agencies together to plan together around land that's held by the public. It's pretty extraordinary to see the level of alignment between their public agencies with a common goal of trying to create housing that is affordable to the population. Okay, so the definition, this is really getting to the definition of social housing. Social housing can take many, many forms, but the characteristics that are most common across all of the social housing systems are, first of all, this concept of housing as a human right and housing and land as a common good. So not sort of pulling away from the idea that land and housing, it should be mostly privately held for profit, and focusing more on ensuring that there is a large amount of land and housing held by either the public, such as the municipality, or nonprofit entities obligated to serve public needs, and ownership is permanently transferred away from for-profit entities, so permanently held outside of the market. That's one piece of the social housing framework. The next is that there's an abundant supply of this type of housing. So rather than there being a very small slice of affordable housing just for lower income people, in Vienna and in other places around the world, such as particularly the Singapore model, which is also held up as one of the world's best models of housing, is that it's a massive housing at scale, and it serves a diverse mix of incomes. So in Vienna, it's no accident that 80% of the Viennese residents qualify for social housing, and most of their developments end up serving a mix of incomes. One way they do this, for example, is we test incomes when we in the United States build affordable housing, we test your income to get into the unit, and we test it every year after that. We're constantly checking to make sure that your income is you're still qualified to be in that housing. A big difference, for example, in Vienna is that your income is tested only at the time that you get into the unit. So even in municipal housing, they're checking your incomes right at lease up. But after that, you're allowed to stay in the housing even though the rents are low. The criticism of that is that we subsidize people who don't need subsidy. But the benefit of it is that all of the developments in Vienna are mixed income. There is no social stigma living in public housing. It's actually considered a positive thing. And there is much more what they call social cohesion, or the focus on people of all types and all incomes living together and living in the same development, in the same community, and sort of sort of respecting all forms of work equally and not stigmatizing any particular type of housing. So the abundant supply of mixed income housing is another characteristic of the social housing framework. And then finally, I didn't talk about this too much, but in Vienna and in most social housing around the world, they prioritize housing stability. And by having a cooperative model be a very common model, what you end up with is tenants that are actually making choices about the housing, that they, about their own decisions. In some cases in Vienna, it is very cooperatively owned. Every decision of the building is made by a cooperative of the residents. In other cases, it's less, it's a little bit more of a where you might have a tenant association that is making high-level decisions, such as which property manager to hire. but they're not necessarily managing the day-to-day aspects of the building. So there is a range of how it's done. But the idea is that they really want people to stay where they are. If you get an eviction notice in Vienna, the public sector is notified and they immediately contact you with the assumption of what's going on. Have you had a disruption in your household and can we help you? Stay put. So they're very focused on housing stability and tenant engagement. And I would say these are sort of the three big ideas in social housing, which is non-market housing, a lot of it for everybody's eligible, and prioritizing housing stability through tenant participation in the decision making. Oops. Anyway, so thank you very much. That is my presentation, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to take questions, and hopefully an understanding, this has helped you understand what social housing is and the key elements of it.
We have some questions for you. I think everyone is very engaged and realizing how different it is than how we currently do housing here.
Mm-hmm.
So how long do people in municipal housing usually stay there? Are they encouraged and supported to move on, or are services provided to these residents? Like,
Yes. Yeah.
permanently supportive housing? Yeah.
Yeah, so very different than in the US. They are allowed to stay in municipal housing as long as they want, and they are also allowed to pass their units on to their children. So you have a unit at very low rent, and your kids are there, and you can pass that unit right on to them. So it's very different than the way we think of public housing. Now, the downside is there are situations where uh, a household at some point was able to get a five, or like what they would call a 5-room apartment. We might think of it as a 3-bedroom apartment because they had it at the time when they had their family, and then their families moved on, and now you have 2 people living in a 3-bedroom apartment. And there are absolutely incentives to get folks to move out of those to try to free up units. So there's a lot of incentives, particularly for empty nesters, to move into more efficient, newer units. And they actually do incentivize through rent subsidies and trying to, help people move out, because there are some housing developments that are so desirable. They have very little turnover. That said, they also have 220,000 units. So by comparison, Los Angeles, which is a city of 4 million, and Vienna is a city of 1 million people. No, it's a city of 2 million. I can't remember. 2 million, I think. No, it's 1 million. Anyway, Vienna, yeah, city of Los Angeles had 4 million people and had about 6,000 units total. So it's very, very different numbers of units that are available. So there isn't such a strong sense of needing to have people move out. In fact, they like the idea that people whose incomes go up stay in public housing and continue to contribute to the social life of the apartment, and it reduces stigma of the housing and improves outcomes for almost everybody to live in mixed income.
Thanks.
Mhm. Explain
Smart
smart
unit.
unit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole lecture in itself. Basically, what happened is when Vienna developed municipal housing from 1918 all the way to the 1960s, with, of course, breaks during fascist Austria, the Nazi period. So I won't go into much detail there. But then they shifted over in the 1980s to doing much more limited profit. And the limited profit model delivers fewer deeply affordable units. It's less subsidized, and it delivers less affordability. So in Vienna, they crafted a plan they call smart units, which are essentially smaller footprint units. So the rents are based on cost per square foot, and they require that every development has some micro units or smaller footprint built units that really cut down on the rents. So they might in a normal context might have a 2-bedroom unit, for example, be 1,000 square feet, but in a smart unit, that same unit might be, 700 square feet. So they're smaller footprint, more compact, and they help create more affordability in their limited profit sector.
Okay. Are tenants of limited profit and municipal rental housing required to move out if their income exceeds the median income eligibility, or are they allowed to stay even if their income exceeds the AMI cutoff? I think you hit on
So
that.
yeah, so they're first of all, their AMI cutoff is close to 180% of the 180% of median. Their income cutoffs are much, much higher than ours. Most people qualify for social housing. 80% of the residents in Vienna qualify to get into social housing. So they don't focus as heavily on income restrictions the way we do. What they focus on is housing need. So if you have an urgent housing need, income can be one of those urgent housing need drivers, but other things also generate need, whether, as I mentioned earlier, a young person trying to find a household, trying to find a housing. They focus more on housing need as opposed to income. So basically, to answer your question, people can stay in social housing forever. They have what are called open-ended leases, which again, we don't really have. So an open-ended lease is a lease that is not month to month and it doesn't have a termination date. So it's just once you're in the unit, you can stay as long as you want, and you can, generally speaking, pass that unit on to a close relative, either a parent or a child, if they're in the unit with you. So they have this idea that housing tenure and being able to stay and have stability is the most important thing. And so even if your income goes up, that is considered actually a good thing. We tend to have a focus on wealth creation through building housing equity in our housing, through home ownership. That's the American model of wealth creation. The Vienna model is very different. They don't actually have the focus on wealth creation through housing. They have a focus on wealth creation through keeping your rent really, really low and using your money for other things. So they actually have, generally speaking, a lot more cash flow in as your income goes up, but your rent is still really low. And they use that cash flow for theaters and restaurants. It's actually one of the things that contributes to the vibrant life of their community, and why they're ranked so high on livability is because, first of all, people there are much more relaxed about housing than we are. It's very interesting to get to know people who live in Vienna. They don't have the same level of stress. The rent burden in Vienna is approximately 16% of the households are rent burdened. In Portland, which is lower cost than most California cities, Portland has 50% of the renters are rent burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income. Vienna has a very low rent burden rate. Most people are paying less than 30%, often less than 20% of their income on rent. So having excess cash flow for other things is really important. Also, because of their system, they don't pay for education and they don't pay for healthcare. It's all coming out through their tax system. So it's a very different model overall in how they live. But anyway, they're allowed to stay, and most people don't exceed the AMI cutoff.
Do you know what the median income is there?
I don't know. I know that the cutoff, and we can back into it, the cutoff for a single person is 57,000 euros per year. So their median is probably closer to 35,000 a year.
Okay, thanks.
And euros and dollars are almost 1-to-1 right now, so pretty close.
Do you think it could be politically feasible to do social housing similar to how Vienna does it in the US, considering how different it is from our current capitalistic system, versus how they're approaching it as the need for housing? To what extent could a state do it without federal participation? So I don't know how that works in Vienna.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think, of course, it's, having federal funding is always a good thing, but at present, I'm convinced the current federal government isn't interested in
No.
supporting this type of housing. The focus will be more on single family home ownership. The We are already doing social housing. Our affordable housing in many respects is social housing. The community land trust work is very similar to social housing. So I think there's models that exist in the US that are very similar to the social housing model. Public housing is social housing. What what is really the challenge, in my view, is one is figuring out what we can fund locally. I do think the land trust model is something to spend some time focusing on. But but figuring out how mm, what we might do. So for example, the limited profit model, which is something we don't have directly, the limited profit model I think is very compelling. One of our challenges is that we are constantly trying to we focus exclusively in the affordable housing space on delivering as low income as possible, which is urgently needed, no question. I think the tax credit system should continue on. We shouldn't disrupt it. We should continue to expand housing through the systems that we have while looking at other models. And I think the limited profit model with a much shallower subsidy that takes housing out of the market is something we should absolutely consider. I think there's a lot of people who would be interested in that type of housing. Not everybody wants or needs to be a homeowner. There's really good models out there of, if you could have a stable rental housing where you knew that evictions were not likely to happen and where your rents were not going to significantly go up while you're living there, that's actually something that I think would be very desirable and financeable in an American system. So it's really looking at can we finance a system like this? The Montgomery County, Maryland model is an interesting version of that they have what's called the Housing Opportunity Fund, where they've created a patient equity source through their housing authority. So this is a federal agency. And they are now funding the development of new mixed income housing where 30% of the units are affordable and 70% are market rate and then owned by the public agency. So they have the ability as the public agency to do a mixed income model. And then, if they decide they permanently regulate 30% of the units and they could regulate the other 70% over time. There's also models that have existed in the US, like the Mitchell-Lama model in New York City, which is exactly the limited profit house. It's really the limited profit housing model of Austria that was done in the 1950s in New York. So worth looking at, do we want to maybe try out the Mitchell-Lama model? The model in New York, what happened is there was an opportunity baked into the New York model that if a majority of the owners of these essentially limited equity limited equity condos decided they wanted to all sell, then they could vote to enable themselves to sell. So at one point they all just voted to sell, and they essentially got rid of all the limited equity because there was this huge economic opportunity for the people that were in there. But it was a missed opportunity to keep that housing affordable over the long haul.
We have a lot of Airbnbs and VRBOs. Does Vienna have that opportunity with some of their housing as well? Are they going to face the same kind of situation that we are?
They do allow VR or Airbnb in their private market. They don't allow it in their municipal housing or in their limited profit housing. However, many of their cooperatives actually create guest housing. So, for example, I've seen cooperatives there that where they develop the co-op and then they just develop one apartment that's considered a guest unit, so that people who live in the building can have guests stay there. it's not the same as Airbnb. It's a little more, within their building, but they'll just create some guest spaces. But they do allow Airbnb in their private market, and their private market is much like ours. It's very active and, robust. So their private market has a lot of, limited term renters, which are allowed. And because they have such an abundant housing supply, they don't have the same crisis that we have, which is, an Airbnb displacing an affordable unit. We have a much tighter supply of housing, and consequently, it's harder to have, to it's a bigger trade-off, I guess, between Airbnb and an affordable unit.
How far out does Vienna plan for its housing? Because you said they're buying land. So we have that 8-year cycle here. So I'm assuming it's got to be longer than that.
They have, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, maybe just because they've been around a lot longer than we have. They've got, 800 years of history there, and they plan far out in 30 years out, where they're forecasting as expected demand. And they actually actively buy land. Part of the reason they can do that is because they have a permanent source of funding. So they have a pretty predictable flow of how much money is coming in and how to buy land, and they buy and they clear and they entitle. They have the same urgent problems that we have, which is people do resist development. There's a very interesting development. I don't have a picture of it in my presentation, called Seestadt Aspern, or if you want to look it up, it's spelled Seestadt, Seestadt, or we would say Seestadt, Aspern, Aspern. That what they did was, first of all, Vienna spends a lot of time focusing on their open space and their parks. And so as their population grows, they believe that people should have access to open space, which is one of the reasons they actually develop somewhat more densely than we do. In the suburbs of Vienna, in the sort of outlying area, Seestadt was built on a former airfield in a remote area, remote as in more farmland area. They took this former airfield and built 10,000 units, enough for 20,000 people. They call it a city within a city. And what's fascinating about it is, first of all, it's meant to be a fully net zero city. The very first thing they did was build the train. So they actually built the train to this location, and you can get right into the city center if you live there. So that was one thing, is how do we get people to go live in the outlying areas and not, get in their cars? So they put the train in. They have both the national rail line that takes you like to Prague, so you can get on the national rail line there, or you can get on the metro there going into the city center. They also created the circulation, so it's mostly walkable. They use what they called feminist planning principles. And one of the fun things about Seestadt is they actually named all the streets after women because they wanted to gender balance street naming. They realized most of the streets in Austria or in Vienna were named after men. So all the streets in this community are named after women. But they also really focus on walkability, on making it safe for children, on having like an ecumenical religious place for worship that a lot of the community can use, because many of the people there are Muslim. There's some practicing Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Catholicism, a lot of Catholics in Austria. So it's interesting to see how they sort of create space for people to live and live together. And they also have they actually have office space there. They have student housing there. They have municipal housing there. They have cooperatives there. They have private market condos. So they have all types of housing in this community, and it's all done through Von Wien buying the land and actually working with a master planner. It was the largest development in Europe for a while. And it's well worth looking at because it really follows the principles of good planning. They partnered with Siemens and they are testing out all kinds of environmental sustainability, net zero practices in the development. So you could live there, not have a car, have access to the city center very easily, and live, completely carbon-free life. It's very
Oh.
incredible.
All right, so it's one. So we've got a couple more questions if you still have time. One
Mhm.
was to put up your email address, your slide, your last slide that had, I think, your email address on it.
Sure.
Okay, got that one. What are the reasons or typical reasons or the process for eviction? Do people need legal help on that? It sounds like you've got almost a care group that's reaching out to them to find out what's up.
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying to figure out how to share my slide. Uh, Here, hold on. Let me just share my last slide.
Thank you.
Again, I'm not the most tech savvy person in the world here. Okay. So it's my first name. Hopefully you can see that. First
Yep.
name, last name at portlandoregon.gov. Oh, not .gov. Okay, I have an extra E on there. It's just .gov. Okay, now what was that question you asked me?
It was about evictions. Like, do people need legal help? What's the process?
Yeah, they have a very strong, they're very, very oriented towards prevention of evictions. They have an entity, the city, the city provides legal aid to anyone facing eviction. They intervene early. So I think I mentioned that if someone gets a notice, an eviction notice in Vienna, or prior to eviction, a notice of default, the city is notified. So they have an entity called, trying to remember the name of it. Sorry, I'm just not remembering at the moment. Mieterhilfe, which is renter help. Yeah, Mieterhilfe. So Mieterhilfe will get a notification that a household is in distress, and they will actually intervene and try to help the family with try to understand why they're not paying their rent. So people do get evicted. You get evicted for not paying rent, but there's a lot of support for people. The assumption is that if you didn't pay your rent, you're having an immediate urgent crisis, and that the city, should provide some support. So you'll get legal support to fight against the eviction. You may also get offered help in figuring out how to find an apartment that is better suited for you, maybe a lower cost apartment. There's actually subsidy sources for immediate intervention and rent payment for for very low income households. If you need help financially, there's actually a source of funds to help you stay in your home. They're very, very oriented towards preventing eviction and helping people in their home. They also have a group. One of the biggest problems when you live in large scale multifamily, and the picture you see on the screen actually is a place called Viertel, which is a lot of affordable and market rate housing altogether. The biggest problem they see in their social housing is that you'll have some conflicts, whether it's generational conflicts, somebody's making noise and somebody doesn't like it. And they have a whole team that will go out and help with the social cohesion, help with the trying to mediate conflicts between tenants and enabling people. They proactively try to get people to live together and get to know each other. So that's a really heavy focus on that.
Um, Thanks. Is Portland creating a permanent source of funding like we've heard about with the 1% that they do in Vienna? So you can get your housing off the ground, and are you going to go as high as 180% AMI and allow tenants to stay regardless of that income level? So will you match what's going on?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, what we're going to do is we have 12 months to study this. So we're going to come back in actually May of 2026 with recommendations. So Portland has just finished Portland had two housing bonds. One was a citywide bond and one was a metro regional bond, but two housing bonds that the city of Portland had about $450 million they invested in affordable housing. And they were very successful. But it's not ongoing funding. And some of the things we'll be talking about and we're studying as part of this study is how do we create a ongoing source of funding for housing? How might we engage in land banking? And can we do things like the limited profit housing model or some other, what types of models might we want to try? Even in a pilot program to do that might be different than our current tax credit model. So we're going to look at we're going to be coming back in 12 months with a recommendation, but we'll go through the process of vetting these options and, sort of seeing what might be possible in Portland.
Um,
There seems to be a strong support on the city council for social housing. They're the ones who pushed it forward, and there seems to be a lot of support within the nonprofit community to explore social housing.
I'm sure you're aware of the Danish model of co-housing, and
Mhm.
are there things similar like that in Vienna or that you
Oh
know of?
yeah,
Yeah.
lots. Yes, in fact, that's very common is the co-housing model, co-housing and cooperatively owned housing. And uh, it doesn't, so the co-housing model, for those of you who are not familiar with it, although there is a wonderful co-housing development right there in San Luis Obispo. Um, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, the co-housing model is everybody sort of individually owns their own place, but has maybe there's like a common house where you can have the community it's an intentional community where folks can come together to make food or um, often they're focused on intergenerational living or people coming together with a shared interest. There's various forms of social housing, and it does exist throughout the United States. The one thing that I've seen in Vienna that I haven't seen in the US is in the US, it tends to be a traditional condo ownership. So you are part of a co-housing community and you own your own unit, but you can sell it at the market price. Whereas the type of co-housing I've seen more often in Vienna is co-housing where you also own your own unit or you own a share of the building, but you're limited on what you can sell it for. You can't just buy and sell at the market price. They actually impose upon themselves the limitation on equity with the idea that they're trying to create stable housing over time. It's just it's kind of baked into their city. So I think, co-housing is pretty active in Portland, and I'm going to be very interested in talking with some of the co-housing folks to see if there's ways to create deeper affordability in our co-housing models.
Okay, probably our last question because we've only got a couple minutes left here. So I'm sure you know our Assembly member, Alex Lee, he's got a Social Housing Act right now, offering it to be financed by state bonds.
Mhm.
Are there any other social housing initiatives that you know of that are considering a housing income tax?
I don't know. Well, there is actually, I would say in Portland, there is an income tax. There's a 1% tax on only high income earners that is going into what's called the supportive housing fund. So that's actually how Portland has financed supportive housing services, is through an income tax. I don't know of any cities that are using an income tax, any cities in the US that are using an income tax to fund housing. Los Angeles passed the United to House LA, which was a percent on its transfer tax on high value properties. So I think if everybody's kind of looking around for different models. And, when you look even at Vienna didn't start with a 1% income tax. They actually started by taxing luxury goods. And, they actually overplayed their hand on the taxes. The first push in 1918 of 65,000 units had a pretty big backlash when folks who were paying those taxes got tired of paying those taxes and said, we don't want to pay all that. And it's taken them, decades of time to settle in on the 1% income tax. And it's The benefit of their approach is the very smooth, predictable income that's coming in, and it's sort of fairly spread across all people. So I think it's worth us looking at it, but I don't know of any cities in the US that are using income tax other than Portland using their social housing. I'm sorry, not social housing. It's called Supportive Housing Services, SHS fund is a income tax.
Tierra Nueva is the co-housing in San Luis Obispo.
Tierra Nueva, yeah, wonderful.
Yeah. And then are they in Vienna allowed to are they allowed sub-rental in any of the housing? So if I have it, can I rent it out again to someone?
I think they really limit or don't allow the subleasing of social housing units. It probably depends on the unit. If it is a limited profit, they may be more open to it than the municipal housing. I'm pretty confident municipal housing doesn't allow subleasing.
All right, I think that about exhausts our time and most of the questions that we got to. So thank you for spending this much time with us. Everyone's really excited about, thinking about this totally differently.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the
the
opportunity. Yeah, great to be here. I'm happy to, if you want to send me an email and remind me this is where you learned about it. And lastly, I'll just say there is the Global Policy Leadership Academy. I think Glenn mentioned at the outset that they're going to be doing a trip. That trip was something I worked on when I worked there, and it's a really great way to take a deep dive into social housing. And I encourage you all to learn more about their program.
Great. Thank you for sharing all your experience with us. We really appreciate it.
Happy to. Thank you so much, Terry.
Okay. Thanks, Homie.
Bye.
Bye.